should jiu-jitsu athletes, or jiu-jitsu in general, should there be regulation against steroids, or should it be the Wild West and everyone can do it?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in terms of the sport going more mainstream, I think there needs to be regulation, Um, I mean, if you look at mainstream sports, like quote unquote, like the NFL, basketball, baseball, I'm not saying these guys do or don't juice, but they're certainly not public about it, right? Like again, I don't pretend to know like the ins and outs of like the steroid business. Like maybe all these guys are on stuff and they're beating the tests. Like I'm sure there's people who say that maybe they're not on anything. I really don't know. I can't speak to that, but like it definitely shouldn't be like it's not out of the public, right? Like no one's talking about steroids in football. Maybe that's because the NFL is doing what they have to do to keep that quiet. I don't know, but you know, I think any like mainstream sport that can't be you know, like the top can't be a topic the way it is in jiu-jitsu right now. It can't be as well known. I mean, if you look at like even Major League Baseball, whenever however long this was, 20 years ago, I feel like at this point, with like Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa, there was like a grand jury indictment about that whole incident with steroids in baseball. That was like totally, shut down. And, like you could tell it was taken seriously. Like there was a very clear message sent about like athletes using steroids, and that is obviously not sent at all in jiu-jitsu.
And like, I love Craig Jones, I'm a big Craig Jones fan, and he posted the other day, like, here's my steroid stack for the Lovato match that's coming up. And it was like sort of tongue in cheek, but he's also plugging a sponsor. And I've always had the mindset of like, I would just prefer everyone to be clean. I want to see who has the best
Yeah.
jujitsu because they have the
Yeah.
best jujitsu, not
Of
who maybe
course.
had the best pharmacist. And when
Yeah.
Craig posted that, I was like I don't know if this is what's the best for jujitsu. And I can cut your answer
For
out if you don't want to get in trouble or hot water if anyone who's like super pro steroids in the professional jiu-jitsu
I mean,
world.
yeah.
But
I mean, I don't like fault Craig in any way. Like, I mean, he's like kind of. It's like his like thing is like he makes a joke out of it, right?
right, right.
Like he's probably. I don't know. I have no idea what he's on or whatever, but he's probably not lying. That's like the message that I'm getting from it. You know. I mean, I don't know. Like it's almost like I don't fault anyone for doing it. I get it. It's so unregulated, and like it's almost like the culture like of everyone doing it. So it's like I get it, but at the same time, I think like for the sport to move further, there's going to be have to some type of like way to kind of regulate that,
Do you
and
think we can get to?
especially if it's going to become mainstream.
Well, that was gonna be my question. Was do you think we can get to a point where jiu-jitsu is mainstream and is an Olympic sport?
I mean, maybe not an Olympic sport. I mean, I'll say this: I don't know that much about the Olympic body, governing body. I don't think it necessarily has to be an Olympic sport for it to go mainstream, but I mean, so they're like they have these like UFC Fight Pass events now. They talked about implementing drug testing on that. Like that's a pretty big platform that's backing like grappling. So like if something like that is drug testing, like or who's number one implements drug testing, or ADCC implements drug testing, then all of a sudden like the whole landscape starts to change. So I think it takes like maybe one of those big organizations to do that. To kind of I know I'll say Polaris, like they're talking about anyone that's tested positive in other organizations not taking them on as like an athlete. That's like a pretty strong stand they're taking. But like at least these days, like the big events these days are who's number one, ADCC, UFC Fight Pass. Like in terms of like getting the very biggest names in the sport. I don't want to say like the most profitable events or the best events, but just in terms of the biggest names. Like if one of those were to take a stand against it, I think that could potentially sway that momentum, in the direction of getting rid of it potentially in the sport.
And I like I'm a big nerd, so like I really like cycling. Like that's a thing that I like. And it was in the 90s and early 2000s with cycling, it was like the choice was be elite and do steroids and you can actually make a career in cycling, or be an elite competitor, not do steroids, and your career's over. And I don't
Yeah,
want it to get to a point where jiu-jitsu where it's like there's all this talent, especially now that kids are training jiu-jitsu at like 5 years old, and by the time they get to 20 they're monsters. And now you have to choose like, all right, do I want to have a career in jiu-jitsu and do steroids even if I don't want to because that's what it takes, or do I want to stay clean and like that's all right, I'm not going to have a
yeah.
career.
I
So
mean, even with cycling, I know there was a year. wasn't it like the top 17 people in like the Tour
Yeah,
de France all like popped
yeah.
for EPO, whatever,
There was the
whatever.
one when they stripped Lance Armstrong of like one of his wins. It was like in order to give it to the next person who never tested positive in anything ever, you got to go down to like 23rd place or something. So it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I don't want that. But
I mean, so in this sense, like I don't fault Lance Armstrong. Like, I mean, like I almost feel like I don't know that much about cycling, but I almost feel like it was a fairly even field because everyone was on it. Like, and he probably would have been the best anyway. Like the same way, like in regards to Gordon, like I don't fault Gordon. Like I think Gordon's the best guy. Like, and if everyone was clean, I think he'd probably still win. Like so I can't fault an individual athlete, but definitely as like you can't blame the athletes for gaming the system. If they can take steroids, like I don't know how you can like it's like you said, the potential of like making the career, being successful or not. Like I think it has to be like the organizations, whereas like truthfully, like someone like Gordon has more power than almost any of these organizations. So like who's number one is not going to ban steroids because they risk losing Gordon's contract. You know what I'm saying? Like versus like if the organization truly had enough power to like control, I don't say control the athletes, but like regulate it where they could actually test the athletes, then like you could potentially start seeing some changes.